all, welcome to this episode of the Data Transformation Series, operating out of the Digital Transformation Lab in University College Cork. My name is Paidi O'Reilly. Today I'm absolutely delighted, really excited to have Caroline Carruthers with us. Myself and Caroline have had a conversation maybe a few weeks ago, and we were just saying it was a pity we didn't record that. But I think, look, we've the benefit now of Caroline with us today. Caroline, look, I think you're a very well-respected author. You're a CEO now of your own consultancy, etc. I'm not going to do you justice by trying to introduce you. Do you want to tell our audience a bit about yourself?
Oh, that's too kind. That always builds me up now. I feel like I should just say I'm chief bottle washer and leave it at there. It's so lovely to be able to talk to you again. So for everybody's benefit, if you don't know who I am, which I'm sure there are many, many who don't, I'm the co-author of things called the Chief Data Officer's Playbook, which is now in its second edition, and the Data-Driven Business Transformation book. I'm currently working on the third. So there you go, hot off the press, that Peter and I are working on our third book to come out very, very soon, hopefully. Well, this year at least, anyway. Don't push me too hard. I was one of the earliest chief data officers, and it was a really interesting time when I started out. And there wasn't really much to help us when there wasn't many resources to help us do our job at the time, which is why Peter and I put our heads together and came up with the Chief Data Officer's Playbook. And it's all just kind of snowballed since then. So as you said, I now run a global data consultancy. It still shocks me when I say things like that. I run a global data consultancy, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I just love what I do. I think at the end of the day, I'm just this massive data cheerleader and a complete nerd to boot. So maybe that's why we just get on and enjoy talking.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So the chief data officer is quite a new role. Why didn't we have it before? Why now?
I think a lot of it has to do with the growing recognition that it's an asset in its own right. So in the same way that people are an asset, buildings are an asset, IT is an asset, data has become this really, really useful asset. And the more organizations focus on it as an asset and treat it as such, the more we can do something about it. Carruthers and Jackson, we've done a lot of research in the past about, the rise of the role, and also not just the rise of the chief data officer role, but also looking at other roles, because C-suite roles do become trendy for a little bit. So we've had lots of different type of roles come and go. One of the things that we've noticed from our research is that the roles that come and stay in the C-suite are the ones that's based around a recognised asset. So believe it or not, in the 60s, it wasn't normal to have a chief financial officer. And yet now, if you saw a board without it, you would think that it was ridiculous. Because it moved in, it wasn't a trendy role. It was based on an asset. It was based on understanding that the finances of an organization are a strategic asset that you need to make sure somebody is championing in a very strategic way across the whole organization holistically. And that's why we think the growth of the chief data officer is a role that's here to stay. So it's grown from this whole idea of, well, actually, we need to do something about that. The growth of data has meant that it's absolutely fundamentally necessary now for organizations to have somebody who looks after this asset that's growing and growing. And that's part of the reason why we genuinely believe that it's a role that's here to stay. And we've seen that by the number of FTSE 100 senior companies, actually even small charities that are taking this role seriously. In some smaller organizations, the chief data officer role doesn't have to be a single role, but it is something that organizations, even 10 to 20 to 100 people organizations, are starting to recognize that somebody at that board level has to have that strategic focus on data, even if they don't have the title.
Yeah, and what you're saying reminds me as well. I'm fairly sure it was the Chief Data Officer Playbook is where I saw, because I've read both of your books, and again, really recommend it to the audience here, where you spoke about, maybe a more defensive approach to data, maybe look at the governance, but also maybe the more offensive, looking at value generation, and then a hybrid. Caroline, if I remember correctly, I think you referred to them as generations of CDOs. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it could be very interesting to our audience in terms of, what's our role CDOs can play, should play, etc.
Absolutely, and we put it in generations because, you know, we've seen this change of the role of the chief data officer as it started. So when it started, it very much came from what you call the defensive position. So we would term that first generation chief data officer. And the reason why it's moved, we think, is a lot of the other talks and ways of bringing data to life that I talk about for chief data officer is there's a pendulum that you have to look after. And the reason I call it a pendulum is because you should be looking after all parts of the pendulum. One half of the pendulum is very risk adverse. That's where your governance sits, that's where your legislation and regulations sit, but very risk adverse side of the role. The other side is much more about value add, and that's where the highly technical term that I like to talk about, the whizzy bang things in data, come from. And that's where your machine learning and data science and, oh my God, look what you can do that's transformational, sit on that side of the role. You do the role a disservice and you do your organization a disservice if you don't swing back and forward between those two parts of the role. The difference between the generations is where they're focusing their attention on that role. So the first generation chief data officer was basically much more focused on the risk averse side, the regulation, the governance, the compliance, than really what you could do with the data. And that's how the role started. It was tended to be the first chief data officer in an organization. So if you'd gone in and there'd never been a chief data officer before, I could just about put money on you were going to be a first generation chief data officer. The second generation we saw sprung up quite fast afterwards, probably about 10 years after the first chief data officer. The second generation came about, and actually they were so heavily focused on the value add side of the role, which was fantastic. So probably they'd followed the first generation in, somebody had put the basics in place, and they came in to like stand on the shoulder of giants and do some amazing things, which is fantastic. But maybe some of them didn't think enough about making sure that the governance was still correct. So the third generation gets to a point where actually you've got that balance between the two. And the reason why you still have to do both and you can't just be in one half or the other, is I often use the analogy of when you're creating a data landscape, it's a bit like creating a garden. So if you're first generation, you come in, you landscape the whole garden. You should be talking to the organization about understanding what you want your garden to look like, what you want it to do, and you landscape it and you create it, and an awful lot of work goes into looking after it. And that's when you should start and get some benefit from your garden, which is fantastic. But if you don't continue to garden the garden, if you don't look after it, weeds will pop up, things will change. You won't have what you want in the way that you want it if you don't continue to nurture the garden. And I have to say, by nurturing as well, it's also still going, is it doing what we wanted it to do? Actually, you know what, I need a bit more of a peaceful area in my garden. Should I do something over here? And how do you keep that? And that's what I mean about how do you swing back and forward through that pendulum? How do you constantly keep your eye on the whole? Are my basics correct? Are my foundations in place? Am I doing enough delivery and creating enough value for people to stay on this journey with me? And then you go back and you do it all again and you do it all again. It's a fascinating role, but oh my God, it's a hard one.
It is, yeah. And to know from, like, you're in a very, I suppose, valuable position now of being, let's say, a consultant looking back into different organizations. How mature are organizations becoming towards data? Are we seeing a maturing of those generations of CDOs, you know, that we're now more likely to see maybe that hybrid as opposed to that first, second generations?
We're definitely seeing a movement when it comes to maturity, because actually we assess data maturity. It's one of the things that we do as part of the consultancy. And we have a model that we look at, which is focused around 12 different areas. But in a very concise way of describing it, what we're looking at is purple people method and purpose people, not purple, purpose people method and tools. Nothing against purple people, we can carry on. And the whole idea, we always start with purpose, because what's important when it comes to data is that you're using it to do something. I'm not a big fan of collecting data for the sake of collecting data when it comes to organizations and companies. You know, your organization company was set up to do something. How can you use data to help you do that thing? So what decisions are going to be made differently if you can get the data into the right place? How's it going to affect your strategy? How's it going to bring things to life for you? And how's it going to double and treble the value that you can create as an organization. What are you going to use data to do for that? Then we talk about the people side of it. And when we talk about the people side of it, I'm sure, absolutely sure you've heard the phrase data drives digital or data drives the digital agenda. We aren't spending enough time talking about how people drive data. So people create it, use it, hopefully make decisions on the back of it, argue with it, tell stories with it. How do we set them up to succeed? And actually in organizations, this is the area that we're probably doing more work with than any other at the moment. The method section of the model is all about, well, how do you use data holistically across the organization? This is when we start to talk about operating model and organization models and things like that, because data is like water. It will find a way through, over and around or through, it will find a way. So trying to keep it in those silos doesn't work. You need to make sure that the real power of data is when you do let it flow and what you can get from it. And then finally, we talk around tools, and then tools are the more traditional things a lot of organizations have looked at around things like data architecture and information architecture and technology. And I would just kind of want to put on the record, we always talk about technology last, not because it's not important, but because technology alone won't solve the data problem. After all the money and effort and time and energy that we've spent on technology, if technology alone could solve the data problem, it would have done it by now. So the model's been set up to highlight all the other wonderful things that organizations can do to actually become more mature in an organization. And sorry, that's a very long way of answering, and to get back to your point about how mature organizations, what we're tending to find when we go and talk to organizations about their data maturity is they've probably focused on what we would call half of our model. So around the method and around the technology and around the tools section, and they've put effort and time into that. They probably haven't spent enough time on the purpose and the people section. So what we're finding is that half the model, they've kind of at least got a way forward with it, whereas the other half is where they're scoring relatively low in a data maturity sense, but those are really powerful ways of being able to jump themselves forward quite fast. In the people section alone, for instance, I'm a big fan. If you can increase the data literacy of everyone in your organization by 1 to 2 points, get everybody marching to the same beat of the same drum when it comes to data, to get them to be curious about it, to get them to want to know more and to want to use it better. That is so much more powerful than 10 fantastic data scientists sitting in an ivory tower. Not dissing data scientists, by the way. You're all wonderful and you know I love you. But you alone won't be able to solve all the organization's problems.
And I love that, that people drives data. And I know, and I remember again, Caroline, was it 6 or 7 ingredients you had for for the chief data officer position? And I think the very first one, if I remember correctly, was around communication storytelling, which I think talks to this people bit. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, one of the things when it comes to data, again, data's like any other asset. In a lot of organizations, it's unmined, it's unused, it's just actually treated like a throwaway, it's like yesterday's newspapers, for instance. So unless you actually look after it and nurture it and find out the bits that it's useful to you, then how are you actually going to be able to move on with it? And actually helping people to answer the question, one of the other points that I think is really important for people is that curiosity. And I know I mentioned it briefly, but I think it's something to really focus on, because a lot of people in organizations, they still have a little bit of either a fear of using data or what it's going to do, or is that meaning that I'm losing knowledge if I'm having to do this, or actually my gut, my experience tells me everything I need to know. Why would I need to use data to do that? But actually, if they're curious about it and then can use data to back up their arguments, to give them evidence, to help them tell really rich stories around the data, then it's much easier for them to convince other people to come on a journey with them. So it isn't, for me, it isn't about using data for the sake of using data in any way, shape or form. If data isn't going to help you tell a story or help you make a decision, then what really is the point? And you need to get to that point before you start get to it. The whole power, I think, of the data storytelling part of it is actually being able to sell your story to people, it's about, well, how can you use something that the organisation knows really, really well to do it? Peter, who's my co-author, for a little while he was the Chief Data Officer for Southern Water in the UK, and he had a fantastic way of talking around data governance and convincing people that data governance was a really good thing by using pipes and water and sewage stations and all that. And what he did was he used things that the organisation were really familiar with to be able to bring what he needed to life from the data governance side. And that to me was a really wonderful example of actually, how do you tell a story using data, and how do you make it so that everybody can buy into it? When I use analogies about data, of which I tell stories all the time, I talk, the gardening one that I just used as a perfect example. Everybody knows what a garden is. I use my pets, I use my child, I use any kind of story that I think of that people can connect with, because that's what you want. You want them to remember the emotion, the ethos, the point that you're trying to get across, not necessarily which, am I worried about 0.7634D on this presentation, or actually, do I buy into what it's trying to tell me, and would I stand by it?
And I think that's really powerful. And we had Melissa Tallick on, who was Anglian Water as well, and talking about the value of storytelling. So that really resonates. I've also heard you, the other side of that coin, maybe, was it, Caroline, you were saying, don't start talking to people about data, start talking to them about the things that keep them up at night, that wake them at night.
Absolutely. I mean, especially when you're a first generation, more than anything, this is one of the most powerful things. I think we talk about, what you do in your first 100 days. And one of the first things I do is get out there and talk to people and listen. Don't do all the talking, do all the listening. And I know it's a bit of a joke, but most people think data is a 4-letter word. I mean, I'm dyslexic, slightly dyspraxic, so I've got no organization whatsoever, and I probably don't. But data is seen as this 4-letter word, so it's either boring, or it's frightening, or they're not really interested in it. So when you talk to your stakeholders, it's exactly as you just said. You want to talk to them about what keeps them awake at night, what they're trying to do, what their hopes are for driving and changing their part of the organization, what they're striving for, what frightens them. And it's by listening to them that you'll really start and understand what's causing them the problems, and actually what may be things that you can do using the data to help. As the Chief Data Officer, it's your role to bring that to life for other people. It's not theirs to lay everything on a plate for you and make it easy for you. You are a strategic leader, and to be able to demonstrate that, you should be able to think strategically. Bit of a clue in the title there. So how do you take the understanding from those conversations and then relate it back to what you need to do? Because if you talk to somebody about what problems they're having with data, they tend to drive straight down into the detail. And then what you don't find and what you don't hear are the really big challenges that actually you can have an impact on and you can help with. Or the wonderful things that's happening. It's like, oh, do you know what? How about we could measure something to be able to help you demonstrate that impact that you're having? Wouldn't that be powerful going forward? So it's all those kind of things when it comes to it.
I love it. And also, I've heard you, Caroline, say, let's say when you're having those conversations, start to identify maybe those small starts, but that you can win sort of big, to have bigger impacts, and I love that. Also, another thing that really grabbed me, I think it could again be the second ingredient. So it just shows your first one was communication. The second one, I think, was the relationship building, and it intrigued me. I think you referred to yourself becoming known as, was it the coffee and cake woman or lady? What has coffee and cake got to do with being a CDO?
It has an amazing amount to do with being a CDO. And a lot of it was to do, especially, when you're talking to your stakeholders, it's not just about, not talking to them about data. The reason I was known as the coffee and cake lady is because what I kept saying is, get out of your comfort zone, go sit, have a coffee and cake with them, just relax, and a little bit of a sugar rush. Everybody opens up a little bit of a sugar rush. But, take them out of the everyday to get them to think differently. So, and you need to build that rapport. Again, going back to, especially as the first generation Chief Data Officer, you're the new kid on the block. which means it's your responsibility to form these relationships. Going into a brand new role, going into a team where you're going into an established role, there's a certain dynamic there. So there's certain expectations on the role. Going into a brand new role with a brand new person, if you haven't been in the organization especially, there's a weird sense of what that means and what happens. So everybody's just that little bit cautious about you in that position, which is why it's on you to establish those relationships. I think in the Chief Data Officer's Playbook, we had this fantastic cartoonist to do some wonderful illustrations for us. And one of my absolute favourite is this picture of this wonderful board table with these really posh chairs sitting all around it. And there's this little picnic table pulled up next to the side of it. Because when you first become a Chief Data Officer, it feels a little bit like that. It feels a little bit like the organisation's not really sure what they're doing with this role and what they're doing with you. So you don't get a big boy seat just to start with. You get the little one camped on the side. And it really is building those relationships. This is a way of getting rid of the picnic table and getting one of the big chairs.
Yeah, I love those the graphics as well. And it reminds me as well, Caroline, at least I've heard maybe CDOs and some CDOs that have been there a while saying the real challenges that can be in front of you when you join an organization where you don't know who that CDO role will report to. And okay, maybe they get a lot of bad press, a lot maybe saying that it can be really difficult when you're reporting into maybe the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. Can you tell us a bit about this? Because I know it's something you and Peter have spoken a bit about as well.
A lot of it depends on the organisation. So I really wish I could say this is where the role should report into. I mean, ideally for me, I think it should report into the chief executive, but I get that, you know, chief executives are very busy people and probably already got a lot of direct reports. There's some really simple rules of thumb for where the chief data officer should and shouldn't report into. So the main one is that it cannot report into any kind of siloed role. So any role that it reports into has to be a role that looks across the breadth of the organisation, because data works across the breadth. So for instance, you would not want a chief data officer reporting solely into marketing, for instance, because then you're not taking care of all the other kind of business as usual data in an organisation, for instance. I wouldn't want a chief data officer reporting into operations for exactly the same reason, because maybe then you're not working on some of the marketing side of data. So if it's a divisional or a siloed role, that's definitely not where a chief data officer should be. Actually, I have seen a CFO, a chief data officer, report to a CFO, and that worked really, really well because of the aspect of there was a healthy respect between the two roles. It was a cross-cutting role, cross-organisational role, that understood that the chief data officer was the expert in their field. The only slight downside was that it tended to be more governance heavy than I think the organisation needed. It needed a little bit more focus on the value add side of the role, that they were the steer that they were getting from the finance side. But again, some organisations, they need to start the role and then really understand what they want from it, and then maybe it'll move into the right kind of place. The place that it definitely should not be is you should not have a chief data officer reporting into a chief information officer. Absolutely fine. And the reason being, those two need to be incredibly symbiotic in the way that they work together, and to have either one in a position of subservience to the other does not help the organisation. The difference between the two, and the simple story that I always tell, is it's a bit like having a bucket in the water. So the CIO is responsible for the bucket. They're responsible for making sure it's the right size bucket, there's no holes in the bucket, that all the right buckets work together, and that the bucket's in the right place. The chief data officer is responsible for the water. So where the water comes from, where it goes, how it's used, the right purity and quality of the water, that's what it works. Now, hopefully that demonstrates the roles have to merge and fit together absolutely perfectly. They should be each other's best friend, because you can't move the bucket and not tell the person that's pouring the water into it, because that doesn't work. You can't suddenly double the size of the water and not tell the person who's looking after the bucket, because that doesn't work. So each of those two roles should be working in harmony and helping each other with their strategies. The chief, and it comes because in a former life, before I saw the light and became a chief data officer, I was a CIO, so I understand their struggles. You all have my sympathy, by the way. I know what a pain in the neck that was. And one of the things that I used to cry out for when I was a CIO was somebody who could help me articulate what the business was trying to do. And that is a key role of what the Chief Data Officer should be doing. It's what outcomes are we trying to drive from the business using the data, and then working with the CIO to go, how do you help me articulate these outcomes in a way that makes the technology sing?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. I think again, it reflect my experience as well. And of course, now we even have an extra complexity in some organizations. We've chief design officers also in the mix. So we've the chief design officer, the chief information officer, the chief data officer. So plenty of fun down the road. One thing, or another thing that really interested me is in some cases maybe the CDO, the chief data officer, is sort of a protective role, but yourself and Peter also refer to the CDO as an innovator, and I think a disruptor were the words you used, Caroline. I think that's really exciting, to know that we can use data for positive change. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I actually think it's data that's a disruptor, and actually the Chief Data Officer is more the innovator around it, so hopefully can use it for good. So, and I think often we hear the word disruption and we think of it as a negative thing. I can't help it, I'm a really glass half full kind of person. And as long as we learn from something and use it, then I think any kind of disruption can be positive. So looking at data, it can tell us things, or it can hold a mirror up to our organizations that actually we needed to do. So, a wonderful example is, and I had this recently, I am incredibly passionate about what I do. I have bunches of ideas. So I'm always like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that. And quite rightly, my COO turned around to me and went, but have you checked the data to see if you're getting what you want from all these wonderful ideas that you kept doing? And I went, no, I haven't, which is really bad considering it was me. And I've seen this play out through organizations time and time again. By the way, I did, and it was right. And I needed to put one of my little passion projects to one side and focus on some other stuff. Thanks, Adam. But I see this play out in organizations. It's like, actually, are you using data to make the best decisions? Are you actually going, what could I do if I tried to do something a bit differently? It's not just the patterns in the data that we need to look at, it's the gaps, and ask ourselves why. I mean, I know there's this whole theory about 7 whys, helping you get to an answer. I don't think 7's enough. I think we should all be 2-year-olds, because if anybody sat in a car ride with a 2-year-old and knows the tenacity that they can keep asking the same question, then that's the kind of strength and energy and passion we need to start and bring to actually how we get more from data.
Yeah, and I really like the point as well, Caroline, there, that data helps us to make better decisions, but it also helps us to ask the right questions, and that's exploring bit, that's really, really powerful.
And I really don't want this to be seen as we should be using data to make the decision and solely data to make the decision. I think, this is for me the whole man and machine argument. When it comes to people and when it comes to data, I want us to use it. I want us to see it as a valuable asset. I want us to stand on it and help us see further and wider and better. But we are creative, fascinating, curious, brilliant creatures. And to say that we only use data to make decisions would be doing us a tremendous disservice. And I think a wonderful example that I often give of this combination that I think works really well is actually around the COVID vaccines. While it's a bit of a horrible example, and I hate the fact that we've got to deal with COVID, the way that data was used to help companies develop the COVID vaccines, I found incredibly fascinating, because it wasn't data and AI that came up with the vaccines. What we used those to do was to tell us avenues that probably wouldn't be very productive in science. So, if you can imagine, in a very simple world, there's 7 different avenues our scientists could have gone through. What we did was going, actually, those 3 I wouldn't bother about. Those 3 could be interesting. That one could be absolutely fascinating. So that then the humans, that are wonderful scientists, could focus their energy on the areas that would probably be more productive. And I think that was a wonderful example of using data appropriately.
Yeah, powerful. And I think it was 100 days, or the first 100 days of the CDO role. I remember the term because it sticks in my mind that, you need in those, I think even first 30 days, you're talking about maybe winning the hearts and minds and building allies, etc. Now, for me, that's a really, really important, initiative. How should we go about doing that, Caroline?
Well, I think actually you touched upon it earlier when you find like that little quick win, that little example of something that you've made a difference with. I know after working with many, many organizations around the world, the one thing that I can say without a doubt is that I can stand there and I can talk to them all day long about what other people are doing. And I can give them example after example of how other organizations are using data to make a difference. I will guarantee you that none of that will be as powerful as me being able to demonstrate something they've done for themselves. So by finding that small example, by finding something that removes pain from them or creates value for them, and being able to go, this is what you did, this is what it took for you to make that small change, but look at what happened. So imagine you scaled that up and really took this seriously. Those are the kind of things that start and win hearts and minds of people, because you have to, and I use this phrase so much, you have to be able to demonstrate what's in it for them. So when you're talking to a CFO, what's in it for them? When you're talking to the poor person who's having to change all their practices and change the way they do their business as usual, what's in it for them? And once you can articulate that, you can start and win the hearts and minds journey. Everybody has a comfort zone. Some of us have comfort zones this big, some of us have comfort zones that big. Nothing wrong with either. We've just evolved this way. So we know that if we stay within our comfort zone, we have a reasonable expectation that we know what's going to happen. If you want to use data in a different way, you need people to move outside their comfort zones, and you have to give them a really, really good reason for why you want somebody to do that. Now, me being the optimist, hopefully we can give them a really positive reason about how wonderful you can make your life and you can get rid of the mundane, you can do these fascinating things. Burning platforms also work, but I wouldn't lead with those if I was you. But it's how you can convince somebody that it's worth them making a change to do something about it. There's a wonderful cartoon that I've seen doing the rounds on LinkedIn loads, and I'm really sorry to whoever created it because I can't remember who did it. But there's a person standing at the front of this big crowd that says, "Who wants change to happen?" And everybody goes, "Me." And then the next one goes, "And who's prepared to change?" And everybody suddenly looks down at the floor. And the thing that the only way of changing that is to go for each person in that big crowd. This is what you're personally going to get out of this. This is why it's worth you making an effort to help me. Does that
Really,
help?
really, really good, because I think it brings us right back to the earlier point so powerfully, Caroline, about understanding those individuals, understanding the people in their own environments, understanding what difference data can bring to them, but also allowing them to tell their own story to show the value of what they're doing and will do going forward. So I really like the fact, you close that loop back to the earlier stuff. Caroline, you're, I suppose, very visible in lots of ways in the data field, in the data space. What do you think people would see as your biggest contributions in that space?
Ooh,
Difficult one.
It's a difficult one. I have to say that this might sound a little bit silly, but in my head, I'm still just this miner's daughter from the northeast of England.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk about me being an author or an entrepreneur, or standing up for diversity and inclusion, it all feels a little bit odd because all I'm doing is just taking the next step and doing the next thing that I think is the right thing to do. So if I am remembered for nothing else other than I want everybody just to be themselves and be the best that they can be, I will be happy with that.
Yeah. And like, I think I do need to point out as well, though, that you are a role model. For me, you're a role model for maybe a new generation of CDOs, but also a role model for female CDOs. Is that something you're aware of, that you're conscious of?
I kind of conscious of it. I guess, yeah, I am conscious of it, and I get some wonderful feedback from people. And I have to say, for anybody who has given me feedback on this one and that you appreciate what I do in this arena for both women and diversity and in the data field, I can't tell you what it means to me, because it's very humbling and incredible that I'm making a difference to people. So when people do tell me that they see me as a role model, that I've actually made a difference to them, I cannot tell you how that makes my heart swell, but
That's
it's very humbling.
That's lovely. Like, and I always hear you as well referring to the northeast of England, which I think is something that obviously does matter to you. Now, I think you've also been very balanced about, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Why do you think that's important to you?
I think it's important to me because that's where my family are, and family and friends are everything to me. I love what I do. I love this to me doesn't feel like a job. I genuinely do it because I love doing it. And I think if you can find something that you love doing and hopefully you're not terrible at, then that's fantastic. But if you don't have that kind of family roots that I have, I would struggle without that. They are my strength, my rock, my inspiration. I talk a lot about my mum, who unfortunately has passed now, but she was a big part of why I'm the person that I am today. So I think that's why I talk about the Northeast a bit, because actually there's this major association in my head between there and my family.
Yeah, and again, it's your own story. You've spoken about the power of storytelling, but it's very much core to a lot of the stories I hear you telling as well, which I think is lovely, actually.
Thank you.
Caroline, you're far from finished, because I just heard you earlier talking about, your next contribution, your next book. You have to tell us. You can't leave us hanging. What's it going to be about?
Well, I don't want to do too many spoilers, but we're
Yeah.
hoping to try and launch it before the end of this year. If fingers crossed, if I can get the right kind of word count out to the publisher in time. What we wanted to do was, with this one, I think we're thinking about data in a slightly wrong way. So what we wanted to do was just be a little bit challenging in the next book and focus a little bit on how do we really get the value that we think we want from data. That's what we're going to focus on.
Yeah. So that move from maybe even data driven to value generation, and part of that new which I think is really important. Caroline, is there any final words of wisdom, because again, you've written the books, we've an audience here of people that are still maybe grappling a bit about what, a data agenda should look like in their organization. What would your final words of wisdom to these people be?
I think, reach out, create a network, use LinkedIn, use these kind of sessions, connect with the people that are interested in doing this kind of thing. One of the wonderful things that I have noticed working in the data field is there's some incredible people, and I've never been turned away if I've asked for help. So, and I'm hoping that I never turn somebody away if they ask for help from me either. So the best way that I've found about learning and growing in this organization and with data, which I still continually do, is just by connecting with people. And the more I share, the more people share with me. And I think that just makes us all better.
Yeah. And I want to bring you back to, and I know we had a bit of a laugh the last day when we spoke about how did you start? You started way, well, I won't say way back. I'll say I started.
The earth in the background.
Yeah. So I remember you talking about, was it Commodore 64 and that love of technology, and maybe that can inspire some of the next generation. How did you start in this space?
Well, I do talk about me being a complete geek and nerd, but I was a geek and nerd before it was cool to be a geek and nerd. I really, really was. So when you talked about the Commodore 64, that was my first computer. And, I remember that was a joint Christmas present between me and my sister. My parents saved up for ages to get us this computer, and I was so buzzed about it. I thought I was the bee's knees because I had this Commodore 64 and I loved it. But just playing games on it wasn't what it was about for me. So I actually taught myself to code on it so that I could write my own games and share those with my friends. So my first, I guess, journey into technology, it started there, and it was my own curiosity that I think got piqued at that point and never really left me.
Yeah, lovely. And I would have started in the Sinclair Spectrum, and I remember at the time was the early 80s. Whether you went Commodore or Sinclair was nearly as different between a punk and a mod.
It was that kind of thing. My husband, by the way, started off on the Sinclair, so we still argue about that to this day about which one was cooler.
Yeah. So it gives a new meaning to this idea of mixed marriages or whatever else.
Absolutely. Talk about opposites attracting,
Yeah, very good. Look, Caroline, we could continue this conversation forever, and I really enjoy our conversations, and I really know our audience will also enjoy. Where can our audience find more about you and maybe plug into some of that excellent content that you share?
Oh, thank you, Paidi. I think the first thing is you can connect with me and with Carruthers and Jackson on LinkedIn. So Carruthers and Jackson is the name of my organisation, my company. The www.carruthersandjackson.com is our website. We've got all our resources on there and lots of ways you connect me. And I think if you wouldn't mind, if I give a quick shout out to the summer school. So one of the things that we do is the Data Leader Summer School that we do every summer. It's been running about 5 years now, and we do it as part of our give back to the data community. So if you look that up on our website, I would love for anybody who's interested in being a Chief Data Officer to apply for it. It's free, runs for about 10 weeks over the summer, and we'll take you through step by step the kind of things that you need to get ready for the Chief Data Officer role. So hopefully that'll help a few people too.
Big time. And when does that start? Because what we'll try and do is make sure this episode goes out before that, Caroline. So when do you normally start?
Applications finish before the end of May, but we will be accepting a few late ones if it comes from this show, I guess. And we start end of June.
Cool. Yeah, no, we'll definitely try and get that out. Caroline, it's been a real pleasure. It's been a delight really having you here. We also must get you across this side of the Irish Sea, you know, for events going forward now that, as you say, COVID is maybe starting to recede a little bit. Caroline, thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. As always, I love talking to you.